Hello everyone, we spoke about different type of oligopoly the other day, and then today's focus is going to be wrapping up the remaining portion of market structures, which is predominantly monopolies left for us for today, and then we are going to go into macroeconomics, which is going to be a major chunk of economics in CFA Level I. So let's get going where we stop. We are going to talk about monopoly. So if you look at here, what are the characteristics of a monopoly? I mean, one of the key things that you've got to remember in monopoly is there is significant barriers to entry. And the barriers to entry can come in different forms. The first form of barriers to entry is economies of scale, meaning that the single firm selling the goods in the market, because in monopoly, in theory, we assume that there is only single manufacturer or seller of a particular product or service. A great example is utilities. In most of the countries is actually a monopoly, right? So, I mean, if you look at it, one of the key things to understand is the economies of scale. Why? Because the large organization who's selling the products in the market as a single player will be able to sell the products at a significantly lower price because he's going to be a cost leader. Because he's going to be a cost leader, what we mean by a cost leader is that the monopoly firm will be able to minimize the cost of production, being a cost leader through economies of scale. So this is what we call natural monopolies. Now, there are natural monopolies and there are monopolies which are regulated through licensing process. Now, maybe in certain countries, why the monopolies are existing is because the government retains control. For example, utilities in some of the countries is controlled by the government and it is a monopoly because they do not give the license to anybody else. But there could also be certain monopolies. They are monopolies because, not because of licensing, but because of their dominant market position, because of their cost leadership, because of their economies of scale. There are other players are unable to enter into the market and compete with them. And that's natural monopoly. And then you have government licensing and legal barriers, resource control, and if a firm is controlling a large amount of resources, like for example, take a mining company in a country, maybe all of the mining resources are controlled by a single firm, that again creates a monopoly situation. So that's an important thing for you to understand is barriers to entry in monopoly, and there are two set of pricing strategies. One is single price strategies in some monopoly, and one of the key things to remember is price discrimination. Before getting into that, you should understand that a monopoly firm is a price maker. He's going to set their own price. That is a monopoly firm. And sometimes these monopoly firms do price discrimination. So now what is the meaning of price discrimination? Is pretty much selling the identical products and services, or you can say similar products and services to different customer groups at different prices. That's what price discrimination is all about. Can we think about some examples for price discrimination? Price discrimination by monopolies. There are some examples which are very often mentioned for price discrimination. If you think about, different classes of train tickets, pretty much you have similar service, but you have different classes of train tickets available, different classes of tickets in a, football, for a football match in a stadium, or you can talk about different types of petrol, for example, pretty much similar products and services, but they are offered to different customer groups at different prices. And that's what price discrimination is all about. If you have better examples, please share it with us. So that's on price discrimination. Now we are going to talk about monopoly cost, price, and revenue, how the demand and average total cost, marginal revenue, and marginal cost, how are they going to look like? The first question is, why do you think your demand curve looks like this? Why do you think it looks like this? All right, so before getting into this, okay, there is a better example mentioned by someone here. Different rates for different slabs of utilities consumer units. I mean, mainly this is applicable for electricity consumption, maybe first 100 units going to be given to you at a lower price, but as you consume more and more, you're actually going to pay more. So that's, again, yes, I do agree, that's a great example of price discrimination. So if you're coming back to this particular slide, what are we looking at? First thing to understand, why do you think your demand curve looks like this? Because the demand curves always do look like that, because it is downward sloping. When the price goes up, demand comes down. When the price comes down, demand goes up. And we know only for perfect competition firm, the demand curve is going to look like, it's going to look parallel, it's going to be horizontal to your quantity axis. That is because a perfect competition firm, a firm in a perfect competition market, will be a price taker, not a price maker. So here is going to be downward sloping, and this is why your average total cost is going to look like your average total cost. I mean, why do you think this average total cost looks like? This reminds me of some theory in economics. This is what called diminishing marginal returns. Why do you think your average total cost continues to drop and then it rises again at certain level of output? Your average total cost rises again. Why do you think it's economies of scale? Yeah, that's exactly right. Economies of scale is why it drops. At the beginning, if you see, as you increase your quantity, your cost drops initially, but later on your ATC, your average total cost, increases. Why do you think it is? Why do you think your total average cost increases at certain points? Is because of these economies of scale. You remember we spoke about it. These economies of scale, why? Because after a certain level of output, organization becomes too big. They are unable to manage the business. There are management problems. So beyond a certain size of output, your cost of production tends to go up. And that's where we say your ATC curve, upward sloping, goes up beyond a certain point. So that's why most of the time you see for any type of organizations, your ATC curves tend to look like this in a long run. So that's something that you need to understand. Your marginal cost curve continues to increase because as you increase your output, your marginal cost tends to go up, and this is your marginal revenue. Okay, now there's a question. Why do you think marginal revenue curve is downward sloping? That is primarily because any given organization, whether it is monopoly or monopolistic, if they want to increase demand, what do they have to do? Can you think about it? If you want to sell more and more products, what is the first thing that you would do? What do you do at the first thing in the market if you want to increase the demand and sell more products to the customers? What is the thing that you should do? You should reduce prices. That's exactly right. You're exactly right. So that's why your marginal revenue drops. And what is marginal revenue? Marginal revenue is the incremental revenue generated by a business when they are selling an additional unit of product. That's marginal revenue. Marginal revenue drops because if you want to increase quantity, you need to reduce the price. I mean, it's also applicable for monopoly because at a certain price, let's say $10, not everybody will be willing to buy the product. When you keep reducing the prices, more and more people will buy your. So that's about marginal revenue curve. So that's pretty much the curves, to how to explain this. Okay, look at this. Now, what is your price? This is where your monopoly firm is going to set the price, and this is your quantity that they are going to produce and sell. And this is where their ATC, are they making money or not? What do you think about it? Are they making profits? This is your price. This is your price. Are they going to make price and are they going to make profits? Because at this particular quantity, this is your ATC. So look at this. This is where they make economic profits because their ATC is, let's say, $8, but their price is $10. So that $2, the difference between the price and ATC is what always we identify your economic profits. But if your price is equal to ATC, say that is normal profit. That's not economic profit. There's zero economic profit if ATC is equal to your price. But it doesn't mean you're making losses because the cost, when you talk about the cost in economics, also includes profits, the normal profits. So basically, when you say ATC is here and price is here, this is your economic profits. So that is what you should understand. But this is in the short run. But the next question is, can they continue to do that in the long run? And we remember we discussed about monopolistic and perfect competition markets. They will not be able to sustain their economic profits in the long run because lack of entry barriers. Many suppliers will come into the market, they flood the market, increase supply, reduce prices. Firms will have to make an economic losses and some people leave, and then profits would be normal profits in the long run. If you understand here, but what do you think about monopoly firms? Even if they make up normal profits in the short run, new companies will not be able to enter into the market due to licensing requirements, high startup costs, economies of scale. When it comes to natural monopolies, firms will not come into the market. Because of that, monopoly firms will continue to enjoy economic profits both in the short run as well as in the long run. So that's the learning outcome statements that you need to understand how the monopoly looks like, explain, describe, and determine. Moving further down now, we are actually, this is a very important slide, and I like this slide. We are actually talking about what is price discrimination and whether the price discrimination is good for a monopoly or good for consumers, good for a society. So that's exactly what we're going to look at here. Let's look at without price discrimination. So what do you mean by without price discrimination? How many prices are you going to have? Are you going to have one or many? If you do not have price discrimination, how many prices are you going to have? You're going to have one price. But if you have price discrimination, you're going to have more than one price. So see what's happening here. Without price discrimination, you're selling the product at $70 here. Sorry, $70 is your ATC. You're not selling it at $70. $70 is your ATC. And let's see, how many units are you selling? Can you tell? How many units are you selling at $100? You're selling the products at $100. How many units are you selling? Can you see an answer? Look at this. 80 units you are selling at $100. Yeah. And what is your ATC? What is your ATC? ATC is 70. So what is your economic profit? What is your profit per unit? What is your profit per unit? 30. And how many are you selling? You are selling 80 units. So what's going to be your total profits? Your total profits is going to be $30 times 80. That's going to be 2,400. That's what we are explaining here. Now, when you're selling the product at 70, How many people, how many units are demanded? How many units are being purchased by the consumers when you are selling the products at 100? At 100, how many units are being sold at a price of 100? You're selling your product at $100, 80. But is there untapped demand in the market? I'm going to say yes. Look at this. If you sell your product at $70, yeah, if you sell your product at $70, can you increase your demand to this point? You see what I mean? If you are able to reduce the price to 70, can you sell your product, increase your demand to this level? Do you know what? Do you see where I'm plotting? Yeah, fantastic. Now, what we're going to do is now we're going to see how to do price discrimination. So look at this, what this company is trying to do. What they're trying to do is they are selling the product at 110 units. Sorry, they're selling it at $110, but only 50 people buy the product. So the 50 units are being purchased at 110. So what's the profits there? 110 minus 70, which is $40 times 50 is 2,000 bucks. And then you also sell your products at $90. You also sell your product at $90. That is where price discrimination coming in, because you are selling the products at different prices to different customer groups, depending on how much each customer group is willing to pay. Here, you are selling it to somebody at 90. So how many units are you selling? You are actually selling to them. 110 units are being sold, but what are the profits for each unit? Can you tell me what's the profit for each unit? 90 minus 70 is going to be 20. 20 is going to be your profits for each unit. So, and you are actually selling 60 units. Why? Because the additional units is what you should be looking at. Because you're selling 50 and then you're selling another $60. 50, 110 minus 50, $60. So $60 times 20. How much that's going to be? $60 times 20, that's going to be 1,200, and that's going to be your total profit, $1,000 to $3,200. So do you think now a monopoly firm benefits because of price discrimination? Yes, they do benefit. That's the first thing for you to understand. Price discrimination helps a monopoly firms to continue to make economic profits in the long run. The first thing that you need to understand. Now I'm going to tell you something more interesting. Now, if you look at the first curve, now if I ask you, where do you think your perfect competition firm, how many units do you think they are going to produce? Are they going to produce 80 units, or are they going to produce here? Are they going to produce here when your ATC, your MC, and MR is equal to your price? Where are they going to sell? What price are they going to sell? A perfect competition firm. Can you look at this graph and tell me a perfect competition firm sells it at when MR equals to MC equals to ATC? So they're going to sell it at $70. You're exactly right. The perfect competition firm, what do they do? MC is equal to MR, MR in turn is equal to price, because they are a price taker. Price is not going to change, so they're going to sell it at $70. They will be able to sell the maximum units in the market at $70. You can sell it this many units. This many units, you can sell it at $70. That's what perfect competition firms will do. But what does monopoly do? A monopoly, what they do is they don't sell all the products at $70. They sell some of the products at 90, some of the products at 110. They do price discriminate, because some of the people in the society, even if you sell some products at a very expensive price, they're still going to buy that. But some people, they don't buy at such prices, but they buy them at a lower price. And that's why price discrimination helps a monopoly firm to capture a wider market share, increase the demand while increasing the profits. Now, there's one more thing that I want you to understand. There is something called dead weight loss. This is something very often tested in the exam, so I want you to focus your attention here now. What is dead weight loss? Dead weight loss is basically the maximum demand that is available in the market and the actual demand. What is the maximum demand? Maximum demand is here. Let's say the maximum demand is like 130, and we say the maximum demand is 130. I'm not able to exactly tell you how many units they are, but maybe given that this is 110, I'm telling you this is 130, maybe or 140, whatever it is. That's your maximum demand. Is the monopoly firm catering to the entire market demand? Yes or no? With a single price, without price discrimination, do you think a monopoly firm catering to the entire market? Yes or no? Are they catering to the entire market demand? They are not catering to the entire market demand. The market demand is here, but they are only selling 80 units. They are not catering to the entire market demand, which means there is a very high dead weight loss. Number one, when you don't have dead weight loss, when you have dead weight loss, there is no allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency means you need to allocate resources efficiently, meaning that you need to cater to entire demand in the market. If you're not able to do that, means there is no allocative efficiency in the market. So you want to reduce your dead weight loss. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question. Before getting into price discrimination, which type of market structure you think is not going to have dead weight loss? If you understand this, what we have been talking about now, you should be able to answer this question very easily. Which type of market structure is not going to have dead weight loss? Is it monopoly, monopolistic, oligopoly, or perfect competition? Which market is not going to have no dead weight loss? That's exactly right. A perfect competition market is not going to have dead weight loss. Why is that? Why do you think they are not going to have dead weight loss? At what price are they going to sell the product in this particular graph? At what price they're going to sell the product? They're going to sell the product at $70 when MC is equal to MR is equal to price. So that's what they're going to do. And are they going to cater to the entire market demand at $70? Yes. So there is no dead weight loss. That is why we like perfect competition. We don't like any other market structures. We don't like monopolistic, oligopoly, monopolistic as consumers. We only like perfect competition because perfect competition gives the right price. Right? There is no influence from the sellers because sellers are too tiny to determine the market price. At the end of the day, demand and supply get together and determine the price. But in other market structures, there is a heavy influence from the sellers. That's why we say we like perfect competition more. Okay, now let's see what's going to happen to your dead weight loss when you are doing price discrimination in monopoly. See what's happening. You are able to sell with a single price. How many units are you able to sell? How many units are you able to sell? 80 units you are able to sell. But with price discrimination, how many units are you able to sell? How many units you are able to sell? With price discrimination, how many total units you are able to sell? You are able to sell, and make sure you don't add 50 and 110. Remember we said it's 50 and 60. Its total is 110. You're not selling 160. You've got to remember that it's 50 plus 60. Yeah, it's 110. So 110 is what you're selling. So are you selling more in price discrimination? Yes or no? Are you selling more When you are discriminating price and you're able to sell more, you're reaching out to more people. Let's say you have, a stadium, you're selling tickets. You are only selling just one type of tickets. You're selling it for $70, only 80 people purchase the tickets. Now you think, okay, we have more capacity here in the stadium. It's waste if you don't sell it. So what you're going to do is you're going to give 50 tickets at 110 because there are still people out there. They want to buy them at high prices, and then but the benefit for that is some of the people who can't afford to pay $110 will now buy because now it is offered at $90. So people would still buy at $90. So how many additional people are buying at $90? How many additional people are buying it at $90? 60. 60 additional people are buying. So what does that mean? That means your dead weight loss reduces. Is that right? That is reducing your dead weight loss. Your dead weight loss reduces. You are improving on your allocative efficiency. Monopolies becoming better in terms of reducing the dead weight loss. Now, the next question for you, is the dead weight loss zero with price discrimination in this particular question? No, it's not zero. The dead weight loss is not zero. So, but if you want to make your dead weight loss zero, what do you need to do? What do you need to do if you want to make them zero? You need to reduce your price towards what? How do you need to reduce? How can you reduce your dead weight loss to zero? You need to sell it at average total cost, which is you need to sell it at $70. If you sell it at $70, you are making a market perfect competition. Yeah, so that's what it means. So the most popular question that comes in monopoly market structure is that about dead weight loss. So by price discrimination, a monopoly firm will try to reduce the dead weight loss. There will be better allocated efficiencies, what you need to understand. So look at this, must have two identifiable groups with different demand elasticities and be able to prevent resale between groups. This is the condition for price discrimination. If you you should be able to identify two different customer groups who have different elasticity for prices, but there shouldn't be selling and buying between them. It's not that somebody buys it at $90 and sell it to somebody at 110. So there's a creation of black market and things like that. So you just say when you're talking about price discrimination, you assume that there is no resale between quantities. Yeah, so that's exactly right. So let's move forward. That's a very important slide. So that's going to spend more time on that. So we're moving further down to talk about perfect price discrimination efficient. If you want, so this is exactly what we spoke already. If you want to sell it, if you want to have zero dead weight loss, you need to sell it at $70. Look at it. Charge each consumer the maximum the consumer is willing to pay for each unit. No dead weight loss. If you have perfect price discrimination, you have a zero dead weight loss, which means better allocated efficiency. Produce same quantity as perfect competition. Look at this. This is exactly what I was trying to tell you. You produce exactly like perfect competition. No consumer surplus, entire surplus goes to producers. Now you might want to understand what is this, which is what we're going to explain next. We are going to talk about in the next slide what is the meaning of consumer surplus and what is the meaning of producer surplus. So this is what we're going to look at. So now let's try to understand here. We are actually talking about two markets. One is monopoly and the other one is perfect competition. We are comparing them in terms of their prices and the profits and so on and so forth, and the consumer surplus. most importantly. Now, this is the price in perfect competition. This is the price in monopoly, and these are the respective quantities in monopoly and perfect competition. Okay, now I have a question for you. Now, at which price you think there is no dead weight loss, there is no dead weight loss at this particular quantity? Is that right? When the quantity is equal to perfect competition quantity, then there is no dead weight loss. Now, the question for you in this particular case, now, if you're selling the product at this price, who's going to sell the product at this price? Okay, now there's a question for this. Why do we say that? There's a question being asked, so I'm trying to answer that. So if you see, why do we say there is no dead weight loss at a price of perfect competition? Because perfect competition market decides the price through supply and demand. So the equilibrium price in a perfect competition market will cater to the maximum demand in the market. So that's why the consumers are willing to pay that much price. If you really look at here, this is your price in perfect competition market, and this is your price in monopoly. Right, now I have a question for you. What is the meaning of consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between the price at which customer is willing to pay and price that they are being charged. Now, the first question for you. Now, do you have a demand at this price? Do they have a demand at this price at a monopoly price? Yes or no? Do you have a demand? Your demand is here. Do you have some amount of demand at a higher price? Yes or no? Yes, you have a demand. Do you have a demand at this price? We know the demand is less, demand coming down, because when the price goes up, demand drops. But do you have a demand here as well at this point? Even if you increase the price, yes, there is some amount of demand. You still have demand at these prices, but because there are different customer groups, different customer segments, they will be buying even at higher prices, but the demand drops. When the price increases, people reduce demand. So that's exactly what we are seeing here. So in this particular case, what is the consumer surplus for the customers? The surplus is that in a perfect competition market, they are able to buy at this price, but the actual price in the monopoly is this, and prices can go all the way up to this, which means this is your consumer surplus in perfect competition. Hope that makes sense to you. This is your consumer surplus because consumers are buying the product at a price lower than what they are willing to pay. That is what consumer surplus is all about. Now, we are actually going to talk about what's going to happen to this consumer surplus in monopoly. What do you think is going to happen to this surplus in monopoly? Is the consumer surplus going to go down or is it going to go up? What do you think about it? In a monopoly, what happens to consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is a surplus of money which the consumers enjoy. So in a monopoly, the consumer surplus goes down. Why? Because monopoly sells the products above ATC. They're going to sell it here. So their surplus is, look at what's happening to the surplus. Look at this. This is your consumer surplus. This is your consumer surplus in a monopoly because they sell it at a higher price. Very simple logic. That's what you should understand. So again, something more I wanted to tell you. You need to understand what is the meanings. This is, what they are. This is demand equal to marginal benefits, and supply equal to marginal cost. So in a perfect competition marginal cost equal to marginal benefit. So what is the meaning of marginal benefit? Marginal benefit is the maximum price a particular customer group is willing to pay. How much customers are willing to pay for a product is what your marginal benefit is going to be. So the learning outcome statement here is that to understand consumer surplus in monopoly and consumer surplus in a perfect competition market. You should understand perfect competition market would have the highest consumer surplus because they sell it when ATC is the lowest, and they also sell it, they are price takers, and market price is determined by the demand and supply factors. But monopoly, the consumer surplus pretty much non-existent through price discrimination and entry barriers. Okay, moving further down, so we're actually going to talk about natural monopolies. So what are natural monopolies? Do you have any regulations here, any licensing requirements? Do you have any licensing requirements in? Do you have any licensing requirement when you're talking about natural monopoly? No, a natural monopoly, remember, a natural monopoly is, when do you say, what do you mean by a natural monopoly? It's not a monopoly because of any licensing or restrictions or licensing requirement by the government or regulatory bodies. This is a natural monopoly where there is large amount of fixed costs to enter into the market, so people don't have that much money to enter into the market, or there is significant economies of scale in the market where new players cannot enter and compete with giants which are already selling the goods in the market. So this creates a natural monopoly. ATC declines as output increases. Yes, obviously, because of better spread of fixed cost, economies of scale. Often high fixed cost industries, high startup costs, and this is why we say other players cannot enter into the market, even if there are no licensing requirements. Marginal cost tends to be low because of economies of scale again. Example, utilities. But utilities might also have licensing. But even in the absence of licensing, utilities tend to have very high entry barriers because it's not a business everybody can easily go and start. Right, so that's natural monopoly. You need to understand about them. Okay, now let's look at this. Regulated monopolies. What are these? What's going to happen in this market is that your average cost pricing, marginal cost pricing. Right? Average cost pricing is basically if government gets involved. If government gets involved when you're talking about in regulating monopolies, the government can implement control prices. Hope you understand what control prices are. The government comes and says, okay, you cannot sell, let's say, tea or any rice or any basic products above $10, let's say. That is the maximum price these monopolies can sell the product. So government can come and tell the monopoly firms, okay, sell the product at ATC. So what do you think? Then what do you think the economic profits is going to be? What do you think the economic profits is going to be when you're talking about average cost pricing is going to be zero? Because you're going to sell at ATC, you're going to become like who? Who are you going to become? And monopoly is going to become a perfect competition. You are exactly right. A monopoly firm is going to become like a perfect competition. That's what is going to happen in a perfect competition market. Right, so basically now we are going to talk about marginal cost. Just a second. Sorry about that. So what's going to happen in average cost pricing in marginal in this situation is that the economic profit is going to be zero because these monopolies are being forced by the governments to sell the products at ATC. Now, when you're talking about marginal cost pricing, this is going to get even more serious. Why? In marginal cost pricing, the government is asking these monopoly firms to sell it even below ATC. What do you think is going to happen there? What do you think is going to happen to these monopoly firms? Are they going to make, how much economic profits are they going to make? Are they going to make economic profits positive? Are they going to make zero economic profits, or are they going to make negative economic profits? They're going to make negative economic profits because they are being forced by the governments to sell the products at marginal cost. So that's going to happen. Then what the government is going to do, they are going to provide subsidies to the firms so that they don't make economic losses. So this is where the government intervention into the free market economy coming into the picture through controlled prices. If you have controlled prices, you probably have you probably have subsidies coming into the picture. So that's something that you need to understand here. Okay, now let me take one question here. Any examples for natural monopolies other than utilities? So, I mean, if you think about natural monopolies, I could think of, countries with large amount of, oil and gas reserves can be a classic example for natural monopolies like LNG reserves, let's say in Qatar is very high, so it becomes a natural monopoly that way. They got large amount of resources, possession of large amount of reserves, or significant cost. If you have very high startup cost, those kind of industries, highly capital intensive businesses become natural monopolies. Right, so moving further down, so we're actually going to show here what's going to happen with controlled pricing. So what's happening here, this is your marginal cost curve, and this is your ATC, and this is your MR, and this is your demand curve. So what the government is going to tell them, let's say, okay, what is this? This is the price at which natural monopolies will usually sell the price. At that price, do you think they make economic profits? Yes or no? If these natural monopolies, if they sell the product at this price, they do make economic profits. That's exactly right. But if the governments tell, okay, sell it at this price, this is your controlled price, the price is going to be based on your ATC, what do you think your economic profits is going to be? What do you think your price is going to be? Your price is going to be zero. Your economic profits is going to be zero. You're going to make normal profits. You're exactly right. You're going to make normal profits, zero economic profits. And monopolies, there's a question why monopolies set the prices here, because monopolies usually set the prices above ATC. That is exactly what it means. They don't set it at ATC, they set it at a point which is above ATC, so that gives them higher profits. Right. What if the government tells you, okay, sell your products at MC, marginal cost? Marginal cost is your incremental cost when you are selling an additional unit of products, which is essentially your variable cost for a new additional unit that you're manufacturing. Right, so that's exactly what's going to happen if you're going to sell it at this point. You're going to sell it at this point. What do you think is going to happen to your economic profits? Are you going to make economic losses? Are you going to make economic losses? At the price of this, yes, you're going to make economic losses. So you make economic profits here, you make zero economic profits here, you make economic losses here. And if there is economic losses, how do you think the government is going to compensate these natural monopolies? What would happen? What do you think they have to do? They have to pay subsidies, and subsidies is probably, you know, the difference between your marginal cost and total average cost, or difference between the marginal cost and the price, you know, the normal price which monopoly would be selling at the end of the day depends on the agreement between the natural monopolies and the government, in which there are control prices. That's how practically happens. So that's basically what natural monopolies and what you need to understand here, economic losses, things like that. And this is, I think, we need to talk about finally summary. Now we are done with all the market structure. We're just going to talk about some more insights based on what we discussed before. Right, so perfect competition, your marginal cost curve is above your average variable cost. Now, this is going to be an interesting question. Why do you think your marginal cost curve is above your average variable cost? Why do you think your marginal cost is going to be average variable cost in a perfect competition? So what you must understand is that what is your marginal cost? Your marginal cost is basically equal to your average total cost. That's exactly right. So in a perfect competition market, they sell at a quantity when ATC is equal to MC equal to MR, which in turn is equal to price. So they are actually MC curve is above your average variable cost. And market supply is the sum of supply of all the market participants. So in a perfect competition, entire supply is all the suppliers' supply added together becomes your total market supply. And you think perfect competition is probably the best market in terms of allocative efficiency, because allocative efficiency is going to have the best allocation of a country's resources. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You need to tell me, out of the 3 markets that I'm going to tell you, which markets are going to have the highest allocative efficiency. The first market I'm going to tell you. The first market is perfect competition. Second market is monopoly with price discrimination. Third one, monopoly without price discrimination. So can you tell me which one, if I want you to rank them in terms of highest allocative efficiency to lowest allocative efficiency, what are you going to tell me? Which market is going to have the highest allocative efficiency? Perfect competition, monopoly with perfect price discrimination, and monopoly without price discrimination. Which one has got the maximum allocative efficiency? First of all, you need to understand, if you want to have allocative efficiency, what you think your deadweight loss should be. What should be your deadweight loss if you want to have maximum allocative efficiency? 0. So the first question to you, out of these 3 markets, which market do you think is going to have highest allocative efficiency? The perfect competition, that's exactly right. So I agree with that. Perfect competition market will have the highest allocative efficiency, because in perfect competition market, the deadweight loss is 0, because they are price takers. Price is determined by demand and supply, and they produce where ATC is the lowest. Price is equal to marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average total cost. Now the next question is, what is the second market which is going to have the lowest, highest allocative efficiency after perfect competition? Next is monopoly with price discrimination or without price discrimination. Which one is going to have highest allocative efficiency. Yes, with price discrimination, but you have price discrimination. Because of that, you are able to cater to more demand and reduce the dead weight loss. But can you all the time reduce the dead weight loss to zero? Is it possible to reduce the dead weight loss to zero through price discrimination? Not always. And that's why we say, even with price discrimination, the perfect competition becomes number one in terms of allocative efficiency. And who has the lowest allocative efficiency is the firm or the market structure which with maximum dead weight loss, which is a single price monopoly. So that's about it. So that's what you need to know here. And I'm going to go back now to the slides. So here we are. Monopolistic competition, oligopoly and monopoly, you need to understand, there's no well-defined supply function. You cannot construct the quantity supplied as a function of the price because of different firms and their actions are different. So at the end of the day, the market is not perfect like perfect competition. So it's very difficult to predict the market dynamics in terms of the supply and suppliers' behaviors. And that's why you do not have a well-defined supply function. Supply driven by intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, and price is then determined by the demand curve, and that is what happens in all the other market structures other than perfect competition. Right, so perfect competition, this is a summary, it's a good summary. Perfect competition, price is equal to MR equals to MC. This is also profit maximizing point. Profit is maximized when MC is equal to MR. That is for any market. The profit is maximized when MC is equal to MR. But we are additionally talking about price because perfect competition firm is a price taker. The price and MR and MC is going to be always the same. So that is again something that you need to understand. And then we are talking about monopoly, monopolistic competition, two types of markets. They produce where MR equals to MC because they want profit maximization, but their price is going to be more than the marginal revenue. But for perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue, and that is why monopoly and monopolistic, they set the price above the marginal revenue, something easy to remember. Oligopoly, what do you think oligopoly? But optimal pricing strategy depends on how other firms are expected to react. So this is a good one. I think it's better for you to recall some of the things that we studied in oligopoly before we move on to macroeconomics. So in oligopoly market, right? So in which type of oligopolies we say that firms, competitors follow a price decrease, but they do not follow a price increase, which is a type of oligopoly in which we talk about this. So when it comes to oligopoly, the firms are independent or interdependent. What do you think oligopoly firms are? Since you have very few firms out there, you have, high interdependence. You're exactly right. It is king to demand curve. King to demand curve is right. So the king demand curve, the logic is that competitors follow a price decrease, but they do not follow a price increase. And that is how your king demand curve is constructed in oligopoly. And there is also cartel in oligopoly where people get together, set a single price which everybody follows. And then we spoke about Nash Equilibrium, what happens when competitors cheat, people don't stick to the agreement, interesting game theory. All of them we spoke about. So that's about oligopoly, and that's a pricing strategy. And this is the last slide before we move on to end firm concentration ratio. We are going to talk about identifying market structures. through elasticity of demand. I'm going to ask you some couple of questions now. Could you tell me what do you think your price elasticity of demand of a perfect competition market? What do you think is going to be the price elasticity of demand of perfect competition market? It shouldn't take too long because you know how the shape of the demand curve. What do you think is going to be the price elasticity of demand of a perfect competition market? How the curve is going to look like? Is it going to be inelastic or elastic? What do you think is going to be? Can they change the price? Can they change the price or they cannot change the price? What do you think about it? Can they change the price? Are they price makers or price takers? They cannot change the price. If they cannot change the price, but they can only change the quantity, who are they? Who are they? What is the elasticity? They are price takers, obviously. What is the price elasticity? The price elasticity is going to be perfectly elastic. Remember those demand curves, guys. How do your demand curves is going to look like? Your demand curves are going to look like, you have perfectly inelastic, the price which is, the curve is going to look like this, and then finally it looks like this, isn't it? That's going to be horizontal. So horizontal means what? Perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. It's not zero, it's infinite, isn't it? It's elastic. You are exactly right. Perfectly elastic. So it is infinite. So that's what it is. Right now, but can you, okay, let me ask you more questions. What do you think your monopolistic demand curve will be? Is it going to be inelastic or elastic? The next question is going to be, if you think about a monopolistic firm, what do you think the demand curve is going to be? Elastic or inelastic? I'm talking about monopolistic. What do you think about it? It's not a difficult question. Think about monopolistic. Is it going to be inelastic or elastic? Demand is going to be. So you need to think if the price increases or decreases, what's going to happen to the demand? The demand is going to respond more than the change in the price. Why? Why do you say it's elastic? Elastic is correct. The demand curve for monopolistic is going to be elastic. Why do you think it is elastic? What is this elasticity? Elasticity is the change in demand for a change in the price. When the price changes, is the demand going to change more or less? If it's going to change more, it's elastic. If it's going to be not going to change more, it's going to be inelastic. It's going to, the price is going to change, by a small amount, and the demand is going to change significantly because of higher substitutes, isn't it? Do they have more substitutes or less substitutes? What do you think about it? They have more substitutes. Because they have more substitutes, when the price increases, the demand will drop significantly because people can move to other substitute products. So that's what we say. Monopolistic firms will have elastic demand. And now again, can we really identify market structures through elasticities? No. The data is not widely available and elasticity can change over time. So it's very difficult for you to say what is the elasticity of a monopolistic firm or monopoly firm or perfect competition firm, etc. So that is why we do not use elasticity to identify a market structure. We just talk about it as for certain market structures. We talk about it because I do not really want to talk about oligopoly and tell you oligopoly has got elastic demand or inelastic demand. I do not really want to talk about it because it looks like they're going to have in elastic demand, when the prices drop, because people are going to buy more of that particular firm's products. But end of the day, you do not really know the absolute size of elasticities, and that is why we do not use elasticity to identify a market structure. Instead, we use some concentration ratios. There are two types of concentration ratios which we are going to use to identify a market structure, whether the market structure is competitive or non-competitive, right? So these are the two ratios, and they are very often tested in the exams. And make sure that you know how to calculate and you know what are the benefits and issues of them. First one is N-firm concentration ratio. The second one is Hhr Index. It's a HHI index, so that's the index. So these are the two indices globally. Regulators very often make use of them to identify if the market is concentrated or fragmented, if the market is competitive or less competitive. What do you mean by fragmented market? You have too many companies holding smaller market shares. That is a fragmented market. But if a concentrated market is that few firms, let's say 2-3 firms, control maybe 80% of the market output, that is a concentrated market. Fragmented market is like two tiny firms. None of the firms really control the market. That's fragmented. So if you want to understand whether the market is competitive or non-competitive, when do you think the markets are competitive? When they are fragmented, they are competitive because there are so many players in the market. But if they are concentrated, they are less competitive because they look very much like a monopoly, isn't it? So we are going to calculate them. So how are we going to calculate N-firm concentration ratio before looking at the advantages, disadvantages? Let's look at a calculation so because we all understand concepts very well with a calculation. So look at this. Look at this data. There are how many firms out there? There are 6 firms and their market share is given to you. Market share is basically how much market that they control as a percentage of the total market. For example, if you take about, banking sector, we measure the market share by the total assets. So the total assets of a bank divided by the total assets in the industry will give you the market share. For the supermarket, we normally use square feet of area, the location of a supermarket over the entire space of the industry, and then arrive at it. And we provided market shares for telecom businesses. How do you arrive at market shares for telecom businesses, guys? Any idea? How do we calculate market shares for telecom businesses? I would like to talk about it because then you understand what we are talking about in this particular ratio. What is market share? Yes, you go by the customer base. You calculate, total number of customer base is using let's say a phone connection, and then what is the number of subscribers you have for a company, and then you calculate for a telco firm, and then that divided by the total users will give you the market share. If you want to calculate them, you can divide them into prepaid market share, postpaid market share, if you want to go more deep into it. So that's a market share. So this is the market share these firms are actually controlling. I want you to calculate first 4-firm concentration ratio. Very simple. You need to tell me what is the first 4 firm, what is the total market share that they are controlling? What is the total market share are they controlling here? All first 4 firms together, you need to first arrange the firms on a descending order, highest to lowest. Choose the first 4 highest. So that's going to be 25 plus 15 plus 15 plus 16. So that's going to give you 65%. So which means 4 firms here control 65% of the market. 25 plus 15 plus 15 plus 10. So that's what happens. You see what happens. 65% is the market share. Now we are going to see, okay, let's say there's a merger happening. What is a merger? 2 firms merging together, form a single entity. So after the merger, those two firms become just one firm. So they merge together. So when a merger happens, so what are the mergers? Acme and Blake. Acme got a market share of 25 and Blake got a market share of 15. So now how do you think it looks like? What do you think your four firm concentration would be after the merger? Can you tell me? Will you bring a new guy into the equation? Would you bring a new guy into the equation? Who's the new guy you're going to bring in here? If you're going to calculate four firm concentration ratio, who are you going to bring in? You are exactly right. You're going to bring a light in because these two becomes one now, 40. Curtis is the second guy, Dent is the third guy, Elite is the fourth guy. So what do you think your four firm concentration ratio is going to be? What do you think your four firm concentration ratio is going to be? 70%. You are exactly right. So 65, 70, and this is why we say four firm concentration ratio, N firm concentration ratio does not help you with mergers and acquisitions because the ratios are not sensitive to mergers because the ratios remains pretty much in the same range. 65 and 70 doesn't really change anything, but something significantly changed in the market that the market leader is now controlling what percentage of the market they are controlling. 40% of the market. Previously, the market leader was controlling only 25%. That is not reflected. So that is a problem. Look at this, what's happening in an N firm concentration market. It ignores barriers to entry, largely unaffected by the mergers. So that's a problem. Major problem is largely unaffected by the mergers, and that's what we were talking about. Sum of percentage market shares of N largest firms is not always four firm concentration. They can even tell you 5 firm concentration ratio. It depends on what you're looking at. Lower ratios indicate competitive market. Higher ratios indicate oligopoly. Do you agree with me? What does that mean if you think about it? 4 firms together is controlling 10% of the market. In another market, 4 firms controlling 80% of the market. Which one looks more like a perfect competition for you? Which one looks like perfect competition for you? The first 4 firms controlling only 10% of the market share means the firms are relatively smaller. There are too many firms in the market, not a single firm or set of single firms controlling the market. And that is when we say the market is competitive. But if 4 firms are, let's say, controlling 80% of the market, then the market is less competitive. It is controlled by few players. So you can say the market looks more like an oligopoly. Yeah, so that's what it means. So we spoke about them. Now we are going to talk about Hhr Index. Let's first calculate Hhr Index and then come back to the theory. That way we will understand it better. So look at this. What happens here for 4 form HHI is what we're going to calculate. I mean, easy to calculate, easy to remember. You will add the market shares, but make sure when you're adding the market share, you need to square them. Meaning 0.25 to the power of 2. Everything you have to put the power of 2 and then add them together. And that becomes your 11.75 becomes your prior to merger market share. And post merger is going to be 40 plus 15 plus 10 plus 5. You do the same thing, it becomes 0.1950. So 11.75 or 0.1175 becomes 0.1950. What do you think HHI ratio? Is it more sensitive to mergers or less sensitive to mergers? What do you think about it? Is it more sensitive to mergers? It is more sensitive to mergers. You are precisely right. It is more sensitive to mergers. Because after the merger, your ratio significantly changes from 0.1175 to 0.1950. that's important to remember. But for firm concentration ratio is less sensitive to mergers, something you've got to remember. If the ratio is 0.1 to 0.18, moderately competitive. If the ratio is above 0.18, uncompetitive market. So what do you think this market is? Is this market prior to merger? What do you think about it? Prior to merger, is it an uncompetitive market or competitive market? Prior to merger, 0.1175 is between 0 and 0.18. It is more moderately competitive market. But after the merger, 0.19 is above 0.18. So what do you think about it? It is more than 0.18. So what do you think about it? Is it uncompetitive after the merger? After the merger, it becomes uncompetitive. That logically, does it make sense to you? When two large firms merge between them, the market is becoming more concentrated, uncompetitive, because a large firm is going to control the market. So that logically means the market is becoming uncompetitive. Which ratio is reflecting that correctly? Is it N firm ratio or HHI? Which one is reflecting what is happening in the market correctly? HHI or N firm? HHI reflects them correctly. So that is why we prefer HHI over N firm concentration ratio. So you know what it is. You've got to remember this is 0.18. Advantage is more sensitive to mergers than N firm ratios. Widely used by the regulators. Remember, I was telling you at the beginning, disadvantages ignores barriers to entry, ignores demand elasticity. We ignore these two, and that's why the weaknesses of these HHI. That's the general weaknesses of these indices in general. They ignore barriers to entry. Even we discuss the same thing in for firm concentration ratio. Ignores elasticity of demand. That's a bias. So those are these indices that brings in an end to microeconomics, and we are all set to go into macroeconomics. Right? I'm not going to give you a longer break, but then for you to refresh yourself, especially for people who are fasting, I'll give you a couple of minutes off. I'm going to start off just in 5 minutes time. So just have a 5 minutes break, and I'm going to be around. I'm going to start shortly. Thank you. Okay, guys, welcome back. Let's get going with macroeconomics now. This is where we are now. We're going to talk about macroeconomics. We are done with micro, and now in macroeconomics. So before getting into this, we just want to understand what do we mean by macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is we are going to talk about an economy at large. We are going to talk about GDP, GNP. We're going to talk about inflation. We are going to talk about the monetary policy, budgetary policy of the government, monetary policy of the central bank. So we're going to talk about a lot more interesting macroeconomic stuff. Interest rates, inflation, unemployment rates. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about in the second half on economics. We are not going to talk about any more price of a product, demand of a product, and things like that. They are done and dusted. So first of all, before getting into the topic, the first reading is aggregate output, prices, and economic growth in macroeconomics. So that's what we're going to talk about. The first question is, what is GDP? We know GDP, we hear GDP very often. This is what is used to measure economic growth in a country. If a country is growing or if a country is going into a recession, how are you going to identify? You're going to identify through GDP. GDP measures the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country during a particular period. That is what we mean by GDP. So GDP measures the value of goods and services produced within the geographical boundaries of a country. It doesn't really matter whether the money used is your own money, the resources utilized is the money, the resources owned by the country, or other resources are owned by foreign investors. It doesn't matter. What is very important in GDP is that whether the production takes place within the geographical boundaries of a country. Now, there is always confusion with GDP and GNP. GNP stands for gross national production and GDP stands for gross domestic production. So in GNP is the total value of goods and services produced during a particular period using the resources owned by a country. That is become GNP. So GDP includes foreign investments into the local country and which are included in the GDP because those productions are taken place within the geographical boundaries. But GNP does not include that. It has to, if you want to calculate GNP from GDP, you have to reduce the production done by foreign resources. On the other hand, GNP includes the goods and services produced in other countries using the country's own resources because that becomes GNP. So GNP is pretty much what you own, what is the production that you own, and GDP is what happened in your country's geographical boundary. Very often, we use GDP as a measure of economic activities because we want economic activities in our country. So that's why most of the time, we focus on GDP as a key indicator of an economic activity of a country. Coming back to the point, GDP means market value of all the goods and services produced in a country or an economy. It is produced during a period. Only goods that are valued in the market are taken into GDP. I mean, you might be doing gardening at your home. You might be cooking at home, taking care of your kids. You might be doing a lot of things, I mean, for your partner, vice versa. But those things are not taken into account in your GDP because there's no market value. But the argument is that if you get somebody else to do those works, I mean, if you cook at your home, but for your kids, or if you get someone else to do that, then if you get somebody else to do that, you pay for them, that goes into your GDP. But when you do that for free of charge, it is not included in GDP because there is no market value. There's always a lot of debates about whether GDP is correct. It will be probably not correct because it should technically include all the human efforts into its calculations. It's not taken into account. So that's one of the weaknesses of GDP. Okay, having said that, you don't need to really become a GDP expert in CFA Level 1. You just need to understand what is included and what is not included. Only include goods that are valued in the markets. Final goods and services do not include intermediate goods. Why is that? Why do you think about it? If you are selling, I mean, if you are buying raw materials in your company and you have also final finished goods, do you include raw materials as well as finished goods? Can you do that? Why do you think what is the problem there? You're exactly right. There is duplication. There is double counting. We talk about the specific term we use in economics. It's double counting. You're going to have double counting when you have include your final goods and the raw materials. Why? Because your final goods also include your raw materials. It also includes your work in progress. So you take final goods, you're good. You don't have to take the other things. Okay, now what about this? Rental values for owner-occupied housing. If you're living in your own house, you don't pay any rentals, so you don't. But for owner-occupied houses, when you are calculating GDP, what the countries do is they identify an estimated market rent should be added as rent when you are calculating GDP. So that's what they do for if you pay rental, that will be taken into account. But if you do not pay rental because you live in your own house, a rental value will be estimated based on the market rates, and that will be added to your GDP. That makes sense to me. And government services. Now, I mean, think about it. This is very interesting. I mean, if you look at a government hospital, you go there and get a free surgery done, or you do there's something free. I mean, do you pay anything for that? You don't pay anything. So does it mean government services are not included in GDP? That's not right, because there's a large amount of businesses in a country is controlled by the government. Hospitals, universities, utilities. I mean, obviously, utilities is not free of charge in all countries. So getting back to the point, if government is not charging you anything, they include that in the GDP at cost. What do you mean by cost? How much cost incurred by the government in providing those services to you? Those costs will go to GDP because you do not have a final value for that, because you don't pay for it. But still, that gets included. So the only thing that you can say completely ignored is what you do at your home, gardening, cooking, and taking care of your kids and things like that. They are not included in your GDP, but other things are some way or the other taken into account in your GDP calculation. And obviously, it doesn't take into account the income inequality. You know, what is the income and income gap between a rich and a poor? What is the people living below the poverty line? You don't take them into account. You know, the main issue is when you're talking about GDP per capita. How do you calculate GDP per capita? Is basically you take the total GDP of a company, of a country, and divide it by the median population. And that's going to be your GDP per capita. And if you think about GDP per capita, is it a good indication of the poverty level in a country? Yes or no? What do you think about it, guys? GDP per capita, if you take about GDP of a country and divide it by the number of people in the country, the median population is what we normally use. You get GDP. Does it mean that there is no poverty? Yes or no? What do you think about it? Countries with high GDP per capita. It is a good thing. I mean, if your GDP is going up, it means that your economic activities are going up. But it doesn't mean that everybody is taken care of. And that is where the most important issue coming into the picture, the gap between rich and the poor, income inequality coming into the picture. And that is what is hidden in your GDP, or when you are calculating GDP per capita, you ignore those aspects. Moving further down, how do we calculate GDP? We calculate GDP using three approaches, but most of the times we focus on two approaches. In CFA Level I, we talk about two approaches: income approach and expenditure approach. What you must understand is that income approach and expenditure approach should technically give you identical GDP, because income for someone is the expenditure for someone. Think about staff salaries, for example, is an income for households, but in a country, but it's an expenditure for firms. So whether you calculate it on an income approach or an expenditure approach, your GDP is going to be the same, because technically expenditure is a mirror image of income, isn't it? It's an income for someone, expenditure for somebody else. So when you calculate income approach, means you are going to add up all the income of everybody in a country. That's going to give you GDP. Or you're going to add up all the expenditure in a country, and that's also going to give you GDP. It's going to pretty much give you the same GDP, because it's pretty much talking about identical things. So what are you going to do in the income approach? Add the earnings of households, businesses, government. These are the three people who earns money. You earn money, households, businesses earn money, governments earn money, and them together, that becomes your GDP. Or expenditure approach, some people call it, you can also say production approach, and that's what I told you, three. some people say expenditure, income, and production approach, but production approach is pretty much similar to expenditure approach. So that's why in some literature or in some curriculum, we see that expenditure approach is mixed with production approach. Sum of market values of all final goods and services. We are going to add all the value of final goods and services, or you're going to add the value added in each stage of production. So what does that mean? I'm going to explain that using an example here. So before moving on that, so what is the meaning of this expenditure approach? Now look at this, what's happening here. We are going to calculate GDP using two approaches. Number one, raw material is 100, manufacturing is 350, manufacturing cost is 350, raw material is 100, retail is 400. Now, if I ask you something, what is going to be your figure that you are going to use it for GDP here? Are you going to add 100 plus 350 plus 400? Is that what you do, guys? Can you think about it? Can we do you do that? Do you add all these sales values? You only add 400. There you go. You are exactly right. Why do you add only 400? Because that is the final value. What is the problem if you take 100 or 350 and add it? Because it's 100 and 350. Are they already part of your retail price, the final value of your goods? There is duplication. So you only go by 400. If not, you can go by the value added in each stage of production. How much value added? 100. How much value added? 350, 100. The difference between these two is 250. 350 to 400 is 50. So that is the value added by each stage in your production cycle. So you have 100 plus 250 plus 50. That gives you 400. So that is what we say here. You either take the final value of goods and services, or you take sum of all the increases in value at each stage of the production process. So you go by the value added. So you either go by the final value of goods and services or go by the value added. So there are two approaches to calculate GDP: income approach and expenditure approach. In the income approach, you add income of everybody, households, government, and businesses. In expenditure approach, you identify the value of final goods and services. Either you take the final value of goods and services, or you take the value added in each stage of production. Now, we are going to talk about the expenditure approach a little bit more in detail. Your GDP equals to C. C is your consumption spending, meaning how much money people are spending or companies are spending on consumption of final goods. I mean, your food, your food and drinks and your shelter and things like that, whatever you have, that is your consumption spending. What do you spend on final goods and services? And then you've got businesses, they've got their investment spending. They make investments. So those investments go into IE investments. You have consumption spending, investment spend, business investments. Where do you think working capital investments coming in? If businesses do working capital investments, where do you think working capital is pretty much consumption, isn't it? It's not really investment. So I will put them into consumption basically. So consumption spending, investment is your capex and things like that. And then you have government spending. G is government spending. Remember that. So consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, plus exports minus imports, and we call them net exports. Net exports is basically what people spend on your goods and services, isn't it? X minus N. Why do you say exports minus imports? Is your net export you want to export to other countries, is what people spend. Who spend that money? The foreigners spend that money. So that should be added. So basically your GDP, we also call this aggregate demand. We speak about that a little bit later on tomorrow we speak about that. Now, For the moment, understand this formula. This is a very important formula in macroeconomics. GDP equals to C plus I plus G plus X minus N. So C equals to consumer spending, G equals to government spending. So where do you think I equals to business investments, G equals to government spending? What type of spending the government spend? Governments make spending on what type of payments they spend. They pay their staff, the public sector workers, they pay money, they run hospitals, they run universities, they run utilities, they spend expenditure. So that is what government spending is. Exports minus imports. You should make sure that you understand every aspect. So that makes me feel that I have to tell you one more thing in slide 64. I want to tell you something. Look at this. Government services, I told you that they are included at cost, but you also need to understand transfer payments are not included in the GDP. Remember, I told you that whatever you do at home is not included in GDP. On top of it, transfer payments are not included. You should understand what is the meaning of transfer payments. The government provides unemployment benefits. If you're unemployed, if the government pays you money, those unemployment benefits and the subsidies what the government pays are not included in part of the GDP. But if you take that money, if you spend on final goods and services, they go into GDP, but not the transfer payments. Because transfer payments are not efficient. They don't really are considered to be efficient because there is no two sides to it. How you understand this now? If you're earning salary from your job, you're providing your contribution to the company and they pay you consideration for that. So that's two-sided. But if you talk about transfer payment, that's single-sided. So single-sided payments are not included in GDP. So transfer payments, no, because there are questions in the reason why I came back to this slide, because very often the questions come on this particular portion, ask you identify which of the below is not included in GDP. So remember, transfer payment, no. Right. Moving down to this, you can split this further up. Consumption, you have consumption, then you have government consumption, you have investment, and then you have government investment, and then X minus N. What I'm trying to tell you here is that your government spending can be consumption spending and capital spending. Can someone give me an example for this? Government spending on consumption. Some example on government spending on consumption. What about public sector staff, public sector workers' salaries? That is consumption spending. Can you give me an example of government spending on investments? Give me some examples of government spending on investments. Infrastructure, there you go. You build the infrastructure, transportation, roads, and things like that. They are all part of your infrastructure spending, government sector investment. So understand this is a big formula in macroeconomics. GDP equals to C plus I plus G plus X minus N. Moving further down, we spoke about this already, so I'm going into now slide 68. We are going to talk about nominal GDP versus real GDP. Right? Very often we have this question coming up. So remember, when you say nominal GDP, it includes inflation in it, right? But real GDP, we are calculating the growth on the value of goods and services at base year prices. But nominal GDP is calculating your value of goods and services based on your current year prices. I can give you an example. Let's open up an Excel sheet so I can explain how this works. Nominal and real GDP. Here you go. So basically what happens is that nominal GDP includes the effect of inflation. So it doesn't really indicate the economic activities only. It includes even the effects of inflation in it. And that's why most of the time when you're calculating GDP, we focus on real GDP, not the nominal GDP. Can you see my Excel spreadsheet? Is that what you're saying, or are you still seeing my slides? Yeah, can you see my Excel sheet? Okay, fantastic. That is good. Right, so you're going to have, 2010, 11, so let's say you got up to 2014, 5-year data. Let's say this is your volume. Yeah. Volume means the number of units that you produce. Let's say you produce 1,000, you produce 1,200. That's a bit too much. 1,020, 1,070, and let's say you produced 1,090, and then you produce 1,120. So this is what you did. This is your production volume. All right. So what you are going to do is now I'm going to talk about the prices. Price per unit. So let's say you are selling this. So at $10 you sold it at 11, you sold it at 12.5 because of inflation, and then prices came down all of a sudden to, let's say, 12, and then you got prices went up again 13. So these are your prices. So basically, if you want to calculate your nominal GDP, this is your nominal GDP. That is very simple. So what's happening? Your nominal GDP is basically 1,000 times the price. This is the total value of the GDP. And GDP, remember, is used to calculate the size of a country. How big the size, by how big a country is, the GDP, and how rich a country is, GDP per capita. Total GDP divided by number of people. So nominal GDP is this. So this is your nominal GDP. So I'm going to calculate a growth now. I'm going to calculate a growth, year-over-year growth. So that's this one. So that's your growth rate. So 12.2%. Drag them down. So that's your growth rate. So how I'm calculating the growth is year-over-year like this. Look at this. So now I'm going to ask you a question. Does this change in GDP, does it only reflect the change in volume produced, or does it also include the change in the prices in the country? Does it include change in the prices, or it includes the change in the volume as well? What do you think it includes? It includes both. It includes the price changes, it includes the volume changes as well. Now I'm going to also calculate what is your GDP growth from 10 to 14. If you want to calculate 10 to 14, if you want to calculate this divided by this minus 1, 45.6% is the GDP growth for this 5-year period. That's your GDP growth. Now I'm going to tell you this is not the way you should be calculating it, because your inflation is distorting it. If you really want to understand the real growth in your economic activities, then how you should be calculating your GDP? As a nominal GDP, or you should be only look at your volume produced? What do you think about it? What do you think about it? What do you need to do? Should you do based on volumes, or should you be using prices? You should be using the volume, the real GDP. Why? Because that shows you how much you are producing more. Price is just distorted. As you say, it's just distorted. It's inflation, deflation. There's deflation here. Price is dropping, and there's inflation elsewhere. So that's where the problem is. So you want to calculate real GDP. So in other words, let me do something here. The reason why I'm doing it here, you will know why I'm doing it. This minus 1. So you've got 2% here. So this is your GDP, and if I want to calculate overall, this divided by this minus 1 gives you 12% here. So you look at this, there's a big disparity in numbers, isn't it? There's a 12% growth here and there is 46% growth here. That's not, that is like, so what does that mean? How much is the growth? So what is this? 23.6%. What do you think about it, guys? Logically, what is this? Which is the GDP growth coming from what? It is coming from the price. It is coming from the inflation, isn't it? So now we are going to calculate real GDP. How do we calculate real GDP? It's not possible to use volume. So what we're going to do is we are going to take the base year prices and multiply the production units based on the base year prices. Let's say 2010 is your base year. So what I'm going to do is your real GDP, 1000 units, I'm going to multiply by 10, and what I'm going to do, this is going to be interesting. 1020, using what are you going to multiply this? Can you tell me? What are you going to do to multiply this? You're going to use 10 to multiply that because you're going to use 2010 as a base year. So this is going to be 10, and I'm going to use a dollar sign, and I'm going to drag them down. So look what's happening here. Yes, see what's happening. Multiplying by this. So I'm going to then again calculate a growth rate here and see what's happening. Is it exactly mirroring what is happening to the volume? Is it mirroring exactly what happened to the volume? Yes or no? See what's happening? 12%, 12%, because you are taking prices, GDP at constant prices. So this is a real GDP growth. So this is how real GDP growth is calculated. They are calculated based on volume produced at base year prices, not based on the current year prices. That's a great measure of economic activities. I'm going to go back. Right, there you go. And these things, as long as you understand the GDP, and this is pretty much very simple thing to understand. So there is something called GDP deflator, because what I explained to you in an Excel, it cannot be done practically. So that is what the logic, if you want to understand what is real and what is nominal GDP. But there is something called GDP deflator. GDP deflator is going to help to convert nominal GDP into real GDP and real GDP into nominal GDP. So GDP deflator equals to nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. Let's read this question. Let's read this statement. With base year is t minus 5. So what does that mean? T is time today minus 5. So the base year is 5 years ago. GDP deflator is 112.3. So when you're dividing nominal GDP by real GDP times 100, you're getting 112.3. That means your prices have gone up by 12.3%. 112.3 minus 100 is 12.3. So the prices have increased by 12.5% over 5-year period. And it is a measure of inflation. Remember, GDP deflator is something which is very close to the rate of inflation in a country. So how can we calculate real GDP? The only formula you need to know is this. You can always rearrange the formula. If you want to calculate GDP deflator, it's nominal divided by real. Nominal is including inflation. Real is based on base year prices times 100. So nominal divided by real times 100 gives you GDP deflator. So if you want to rearrange the formula, real GDP becomes here nominal divided by deflator times 100. That gives you your real GDP. In other words, nominal GDP divided by GDP deflator divided by 100. That gives you again your real GDP. Okay, let's look at this question. GDP in 2002 is 1.8 billion at 2002 prices and 1.65 billion when calculated using 20x1 prices. Okay, now you need to tell me first of all what is real GDP here and what is nominal GDP. I want to understand first. You are getting that point. This is 1.8 billion. Is that real or nominal? They are calculated based on 20x2 prices. Are they nominal or real? What do you think about it? And what do you think 1.65 billion is? It is calculated using 2000x1 prices. You are right. 1.8 is nominal and 1.65 is real. Why? Because you are using a base year prices. What is your base year? What is your base year? 20x1. So we are going to calculate the GDP deflator based on 20x1 base period. How do you calculate nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100? So 1.8 divided by 1.65 times 100. 100 is 109.1. What is your rate of inflation? Can you tell me? What is your rate of inflation using this slide? What it is? Your GDP deflator is 109.1, your inflation is 9.1 because you always remove 100 from that. Your rate of inflation is 9.1 and GDP deflator is a good measure of what? I told you this a while ago. GDP deflator is a good measure of what? What can you do with the GDP deflator? It's a good measure of what? Inflation. Do you think it's a good measure of inflation? Yes, indeed. It is a good measure of inflation. It's used to convert nominal GDP to real GDP. Okay, let's look at this question. Nominal GDP was 213 billion in 20x6. And okay, so there is a question here. Why do you think GDP deflator you need to remove 100 because you are multiplying it by 100? So your answer is multiply 100 plus inflation because you multiply by 100. So that's why you remove 100 if you understand. Why do you remove 100 from that? Because you multiply here. Okay, so nominal GDP was 213 billion in 20x6 and 150 billion in 20x1. 20x6 GDP deflator relative to the base year is 122.3. Calculate the real GDP for 20x6 and the compound annual real growth rate of the economy between 20x1 to 20x6. So what happens here? So how do you calculate real GDP? Real GDP equals to nominal GDP divided by GDP deflator gives you real GDP, right? So what is the nominal GDP, guys, here? What is the nominal GDP in 20x6? What is the nominal GDP in 20x6 here? Nominal GDP is 213 billion in 20x6 and 150 billion in 20x1. Yeah, can you calculate the growth between those two and say that is your economic growth? Can you say that? Can you calculate the difference between 213 and 150? Is it the real economic growth? What are the two things that it includes? What are the two things that it includes between in 20x1 your GDP was 150 and GDP is 213 in 20x6? Does it include inflation? Yes or no? Do you think it includes inflation? Yes, it does. Okay, so what effectively GDP deflator is doing, it is removing the inflation from that. So that's what we're doing. What are we doing? 213 divided by 1.223. What is 1.223? Can you tell me what is that? Is that GDP deflator? Yes. And what is your base year? 20x1. And you should understand base year well now because I showed you in Excel how base year works. That's base year. So 1.223. What are you getting? 174.16. So when you want to calculate economic growth, the real economic growth, you're going to compare 213 versus 150 or you want to compare 174 with 150 if you want to calculate the real GDP growth. What are you going to do? Are you going to compare 213 with 150? 174 with 150. That is what is going to give you your GDP growth. That is exactly right. You are right. That is exactly going to give you your GDP growth. If you want to calculate nominal GDP growth, what are the two numbers you should be comparing? Can you answer this question? What are the two numbers you are going to compare if you want to calculate nominal GDP growth? If I ask you to calculate nominal GDP growth, what are the two numbers you're going to compare? Are you going to compare? You guys answer. Are you very tired? What are the two numbers you're going to compare? We are calculating nominal GDP. This is going to be the last slide. See, yeah, that's exactly right. So you're going to compare 213 billion and what is the other number that you're going to compare? 213 billion is your nominal GDP. You're going to compare that and what? 213 and 150. That's correct. So that's what you're going to say. That's your GDP growth. 213 and 150. But if you're calculating real GDP growth, you first identify the real GDP using GDP Deflator. 213 divided by 1.223 gives you 174.16. And then you calculate real GDP growth. That's for how many years? We need to calculate the compound real annual growth rate. Some people call it CAGR in practice. So ending number divided by beginning number to the power of 1 divided by n minus 1. That gives you cumulative or compound average growth rate is 3.43. Nominal GDP will be 213 divided by 150 to the power of 1 by 5 minus 1. And when you are counting number of years, you should be very careful. You should be counting the number of years correctly. If you calculate, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're going to end up using 6 years, which is not right. Don't count, basically, when you're counting it, don't count the first year, or you ignore the last year. You should be, because if you talk about 6-year data, how many growth will be there? How many growth will be there in a 6-year period? Can you answer this question? If you have 6-year period, how many growths are there? Only 5 growths are there. So you should always remove 1. Most of the mistakes that I have seen in cumulative average growth rate calculation is that people count the number of years in between and you go wrong. You have to remove 1. So 174 divided by 150 to the power of 1 by n minus 1, 3.04. What does that mean? Annually, your GDP has grown 3.03. If you want to understand this practically, you can do this. You take 3.03, multiply by, you take 150, multiply by 1.0303 5 times. Can you do that? 150 times 1.0303, multiply 5 times. Tell me what you're getting. 1.03035. Doing it for the 3rd time, 4th time, 5th time. I'm getting 174.16. So that's what it means. On a compound basis, if you grow by 3.03, starting from 150, you will end up at 174.16. So on an annual basis, economy has grown by 3.03, and that is the GDP deflator. I will stop with this today, and that is the end of the production approach or expenditure approach, and we are going to move on to income approach from tomorrow, and I'm going to see you tomorrow, and thank you.